Hello and welcome to a new episode of In the District. Today we're sitting down with District 84 Assembly member Amanda Séptimo. Join us to learn more about her early beginnings, advocacy work, and much more. I'm Kibin Alleyne, and this program is brought to you from BronxNet's brand new media and technology studios here in the South Bronx. Assembly member, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, thank you for having me. It's always great to be here at BronxNet.
Now, I definitely want to take a moment to talk about, just to learn a little bit more about your thoughts on our studio. Can you just please tell us, what are your first thoughts? What are you thinking?
I mean, it's a beautiful space. You look around, it's flooded with sunlight. You get some of the best views of the South Bronx in the background. But I think the best thing about this location is its location. It's really in the heart of the South Bronx, which I think is at the heart of BronxNet's mission, to be close to community, in community. And this studio is a culmination of all of those efforts and all of those goals.
And expanding on that, can you just talk about the importance of media literacy training and education in the Bronx?
Of course. I mean, I think, in a modern world where everything that we do is so technologically focused, and how people get everything from information to education to healthcare, everything is really delivered through some digital format in one form or another. And so when you're talking about giving people the skills that they need to not only survive in our community, but to thrive and to advance and to have the economic mobility and the growth and the progress that we all want our families to have, media literacy and training are at the center of that. And to be competitive in this world and to be at the forefront of cutting edge technology and careers, you need to be able to have that grounding and that education. And it's so important that BronxNet is a place that does that, where students from our community can come here, learn, and really have the fast track into careers that are going to be sustaining, but also that are going to grow into the future. So I'm really grateful to BronxNet for all that it does.
Now, I want to expand on ideas about education. Before you started, you talked a little bit about your education and how you're continuing that. Can you just talk about the role education has played in your effort to remain involved in your community?
Yeah, I think education, like we all know, is so foundational to everything that you do. It helps shape your view of the world, how you show up as a citizen of the world. But I think education happens in a lot of ways, especially in our modern world. It's not only what happens in the four walls of a school anymore. Education is what happens when you come home from school. It's what videos you're watching. It's what programs you're consuming. Education is also still very much some of that formal training, but it's also maybe not the same path for everyone. Once upon a time, we would think, you have to go through every step. You go from middle school to high school to college, but now we're seeing many folks who are able to come from high school and go right into career tracks that are giving them many opportunities, even when they're not on that traditional education path. So for me, my education is the foundation of who I am. I would not be who I was if I didn't go to the schools that I did and have the experiences that I've had. But I'm also really aware of the fact that I'm learning every single day, and really my job is to learn every single day as a representative of the South Bronx. Despite being born and raised here, every day there's an opportunity to learn more about our community and how we can better serve it and support it.
Now, I'd love to take a moment to explore your youth, because just learning about you, I was so shocked at how young you were when you started, basically, I would say, kind of changing your environment. I understand that you were 12 years old when you became socially aware about, the impact, society was having on your neighborhood. Can you tell me a little bit more about that journey?
Yeah, I had the privilege of working with the Point CDC, which is an organization based out of Hunts Point that leads in environmental justice and is really focused on social justice issues. And the Point is just one example of all of the fantastic nonprofits that we have in our community who are showing up every day, standing in the gap where there are issues created, working to fill those gaps and work with people to empower them to say, how can we be leaders in our community? And I was one of the very lucky students who got to start in those programs early. I also was involved with the New York City Parks Department, which also has great programs for young people to get involved. And at its core, they're great organizations that are doing great work supporting me, but really at the center of that is adults who are committed to me as a young person. And that's something that I try to do every day, to remember that as adults in the South Bronx, we have a responsibility to our young people to empower them, to remind them that they are powerful, that living in a community right now, just because you're 15 doesn't mean you don't have the power to make change. And that was true for me because there were adults in my life who spoke that into me and helped me believe it. And so I definitely think it's part of my charge to make other young people feel empowered in the same way.
Now, I'm curious to know what kind of, caused that spark, because I know when I was 12, I was not changing the world, I was a good kid. But, what kind of, ignited that spark in you to say, hey, I could do a lot more at that age?
Sure. It wasn't so conscious. I actually was going to school, and my school had a volunteer requirement. We had to volunteer for a certain number of hours every year, and at that point I was still too young to have working papers, and so I just kind of needed to find a way to fill my time. We'd had the Hunts Point Rec Center had opened just a block away from the street that I grew up on, and so I went there to kind of see what kind of volunteering could I do, and then it just kind of ran from there. And I think, again, when you walk into an organization that does good work and there are good people there, you kind of fall in love with the experience and you keep coming back for more and figuring out how can you continue to support, continue to help, and continue to grow. And I think when you're that young, you don't even really realize what's happening, but what's happening is that you're realizing your power, and that's what happened to me.
Now, how has that experience and a lot of the programs you've been a part of paved the way for your work in advocacy as you became an adult?
Again, I think it really just gave me the confidence to be able to identify an issue in my community and know that I'm already qualified as an expert just by someone who lives there. I think people like to trick you into thinking that you have to go through some formal schooling, some formal process to become a person who can solve problems, and that's not true. If you live in a community and you're experiencing the problems every day, then you are certainly qualified to come up with some of those solutions because you have the experience necessary. And so having that confidence from such a young age to be able to identify problems in my community and really believe that I had the power to think creatively about solutions is something that I've carried with me and continues throughout my career today, to say we all have a responsibility and we all have power to step in and change.
Now, I understand that you also took this advocacy work internationally with the YMCA, which sounds very exciting. Can you tell me a little bit more about that experience traveling to West Africa?
Yes.
And, how has it shaped the way you take on issues facing not only your community, but, across the globe?
Yeah, so that was a really amazing experience with the International YMCA when I was young as well. And again, it was another experience as a young person to be empowered, but it also was an experience to just become more worldly and to see other parts of the world that live really differently than us, but also to appreciate that as different as we are, we share a lot in common with communities across the world, and that unfortunately some struggles really are universal. And so that experience, I think, made me a better advocate at home, but also made me more of a global citizen and understanding that our international struggles are connected. There are no borders when it comes to questions of access to reproductive justice. There are no borders when you're talking about women's rights. There are no borders when you're talking about access to food. And those are just some of the principles that I think are foundational, and that over the years, my time in more international spaces has helped me really fortify.
Now, what I think is so interesting, we're talking about, just your work as a young person, essentially a child, and, doing some of these things. How do you, even now as an adult, kind of tackle these really hard challenges or these really hard topics with children who want to make a difference?
I think the first thing that I'm always mindful of is sort of working to almost forget that they're children and hear ideas and perspectives for what they are. The perspectives of people who are experiencing an issue firsthand. You don't get more expert than that. And I make sure that as a leader, I am not only, again, empowering young people, reminding them that I started as young as they were or younger, but also working to make sure that they understand that we are genuinely listening, we are genuinely taking these things in, and making sure that change comes of these suggestions.
Now, I also want to talk about, just over the years, a lot of the amazing work you have done. It's been recognized by people within the community. I understand Community Board too, and even the Yankees, recognize a lot of the work that you've done. Can you just say how it feels to know that the work you're doing is being seen and heard by the leaders around you?
Sure. I won that Community Board 2 award and the Yankee Award when I was like 15. But then even just a couple of years ago, I was honored by St. Anne's Corner of Harm Reduction for the same kind of work. And for me, it's very special that folks in the community actually see and feel the impact of my effort. When I'm 15, I certainly didn't expect it, but it's just as humbling as an adult and as an Assembly member, because really I just wake up every day and I try my best in terms of serving the community, in terms of making sure we're moving the needle on issues that matter to people on a daily basis. We know that folks sometimes lose their confidence in their elected officials, and they lose confidence in the fact that these systems are actually designed to help them. And it's really special to me to know that there are people out there who appreciate that I am really showing up for our community and to make sure that our community is felt, is represented, and is getting what it deserves.
And speaking of that, I want to talk about how, among those young people who sometimes lose confidence in their elected officials, young people, are part of that, although they tend to often be very outspoken in talking about what they want to see from their community. What advice would you have, for a young person who's watching that may feel a little bit disconnected from their elected leaders?
Yeah. I think there are two things. The number one piece of advice I would always give is to vote. And I know that sounds so cliche. I tell people all the time, I don't care who you vote for, I just want you to vote, because that engagement and that participation makes such a difference, and it really matters. And when you look at the difference between communities like the South Bronx that have to fight at every turn for resources, and communities like some other ones, maybe in Manhattan, who have everything that they need, seemingly, and more, one of the primary differences is voter turnout and how that shows itself in some of the subsequent services and the way service delivery happens. And it's not fair and it's not right, but it's how it happens. So the first thing that I would say is to vote. But then the second thing, which is equally important, is not to lose sight of the fact that you could be an elected leader, right? That's how I got into this. I started in volunteering and social justice work and environmental justice work, but I decided to run for office because what I saw was what I thought was a gap in leadership. I felt like our community needed leadership that was going to stand up and fight and demand more in ways that just weren't happening. And so I said, okay, I'm not going to wait to see it happen because it may never. I'm going to get in the ring and do it myself. And so if you're disillusioned and you're not happy with what you see, then that should be an invitation to get in the ring and do the work.
All right, thank you so much for sharing that.
Of course.
It's time to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll have some final thoughts from Assembly Member Amanda Séptimo. Stay with us.
.7% of Bronxites currently experience food insecurity. Meanwhile, instead of these nice, colorful foods, this is the best food that they have access to. If this sounds like you, there are a bunch of resources to get healthy food for free or cheap. If you want to help, you might consider donating or volunteering in one of these places. Community fridges like this one are all over the city, and allow New Yorkers to conveniently donate extra food to people who might need it. Go to this link and find your nearest one. Food banks and pop-up events like these provide millions of healthy meals to families in need. These organizations are distributing meals to Bronxites as we speak, and are always accepting donations and volunteers.
Welcome back. Hope you're enjoying today's In the District discussion with District 84 Assembly Member Amanda Séptimo. Assembly Member, thank you so much for joining us again.
Of course, thank you for having me.
Now, I want to take a moment to talk about the work that you're doing now. I understand that as an Assembly member, you aim to bring true equity into the South Bronx. What does that equity look like?
That's a good question. I think one of the things that we talk about in government is concepts of equity. But if you look at how city resources are doled out and how policy is made, really, even on the state level, what we actually focus more on is equality. And that sounds like it should be a good thing, but equality really is rooted in everyone having the same. But equity, in my opinion, is actually making sure that everybody has what they need. And because the South Bronx has been so disinvested in for decades, we need more than other communities to be able to be made whole. And that's in everything from environmental justice, right? We've got peaker plants that are polluting our air on a constant basis, all the way through to economic development. We are consistently ranked at some of the poorest communities in New York State and in the country. And when you're talking about stats like that for decades at a time, then you know it's not just a blip. That's a systemic set of policy decisions that are happening that are continuing to harm our community. And so I feel like my charge as an assembly member is to challenge those systems and those decisions when they happen in the ways that they happen and say, enough is enough. It's time for the Bronx to get its fair share.
Now, what I'm so glad that I'm able to see, and I'm sure you probably feel the same way, is that you're from the South Bronx. And I think that representation is so important because just in doing this work, I know that like maybe 40 years ago, that wasn't the case. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about, the importance of having someone from the community, be a leader within this community?
Yeah, I mean, I think the South Bronx is a place that is really unique. The Bronx overall, but especially the South Bronx. And I think to understand that history intimately is really important. And I think one of the most important things about the Bronx is that publicly, there's one story kind of told about our community. We hear all of these kind of negative statistics. And then when you live in the community, you have sort of a different experience. And growing up, I would always kind of think about the fact that I would hear all of these negative things about where I was from. But the community that I existed in was full of people who love each other and support each other and want to see each other do well. And understanding that difference in how people receive our community versus what our community really is, I think is something that's rooted in being from here. And so when I see people who are in leadership who are born and raised in the Bronx, I think it does take on a different flavor of leadership because there are some things that you just can't quite put into words or understand unless you're from here.
Now, I also want to talk about the fact your cultural background, just also the fact that, you're a woman in politics here in the Bronx. I think that's amazing. And we're seeing so much of that growing in the Bronx. Can you talk about that representation and what that means for, little girls of color in this borough?
Yeah. So my mother is Dominican. My grandparents came from the Dominican Republic, and my father is Black American. And, that is, I think, the picture of the Bronx, right? We're a community that is made up of people of color. We're a community that's made up of immigrants and children of immigrants and grandchildren of immigrants. And I think that it's important for all representatives to understand at least some part of the immigrant experience, and for all representatives to understand what does it mean to be a person of color in New York, not only from a statistical experience, but what does it mean on a daily basis to wake up as a woman of color in this city, in this country, and in this moment. And so I'm really proud to be a woman of color who stands up every day, who speaks Spanish and does it without shame. I speak Spanish when I'm on the floor in the Assembly chamber, and I do so proudly because I'm there to represent my community, and that's certainly what our community is made up of. And so I hope that that's inspiration for young girls everywhere, because I'm no different. I grew up in the South Bronx like every other young girl who's in the South Bronx right now, and I'm confident that in the future we'll see more young women of color from the Bronx leading in the Assembly and other positions throughout.
Now, I definitely want to take a moment to talk about the visibility of people of color in New York City, especially when we look back at our history. I understand that right now one of your efforts is to make sure that people of color, but specifically Puerto Ricans, are visible in the 9/11 Museum. Can you tell me a little bit more about, or just walk me through, when did you realize this was something that you wanted to work on?
Yeah. So I mentioned I'm a Dominican woman, but right now is Hispanic Heritage Month, and I think it's such a a special time because it's a moment where we get to celebrate all of the Hispanic heritage in our community. And I'd visited the 9/11 Museum at some point last year down by Ground Zero, and when you walk in, there's this really beautiful display of flags. And you can't help but notice it and kind of get stopped by it. And I looked up and I was kind of looking at the flags, and they explained that those flags are a representation of every country that lost someone in the tragedy. And I thought that was a really beautiful way to honor the spirit of victims who had been lost. But as I was looking, for familiar flags, and to be from the South Bronx is to look for the Puerto Rican flag. And I looked and I noticed that it was missing, so I asked. And the museum tour guide let me know that the museum actually was only displaying the flags of nations that belong to the United Nations. And that would mean that Puerto Rico's flag could not be flown because it is technically part of the United States. And I said, that doesn't seem right. If we're here to honor the spirit of the victims, then there should certainly be a Puerto Rican flag up there, because we know that there are people who died in that tragedy who were connected to Puerto Rico and who would certainly choose to fly that flag if given the choice. And so really from that moment is when we decided we were going to take this on.
And can you tell us, what can we look forward to, what's currently in the process of that right now?
Yeah, so we formally kind of reached out to the museum and asked them to consider changing that policy. Again, making sure that they understood that if the true goal of this is to honor the spirit of victims, then you need to have the Puerto Rican flag on display as well to honor those victims and their families. And so we wrote a letter, and we had some phone calls, and we've recently heard that the museum will be taking up a vote to decide whether this will happen or not this spring. And so we hope to have good news, but I'm confident that the 9/11 Museum, again, is really dedicated to the spirit of survivors and the spirit of New York City. And that is certainly inclusive of the Puerto Rican community in a big way. So I'm hopeful that we will see the Puerto Rican flag flying there soon.
That's amazing. And I'm so glad that you were able to share that with us, because I think as a city, we talk about 9/11 and how it's impacting so many different communities, and how it became one. And so I love that you saw something that was missing and you decided to speak up about it, because I know that oftentimes when we see something that we feel disheartened by, we just deal with it and walk away.
Right.
But I love that you took that initiative to say, no, I think we should change this. Yeah. And I want to know what I know that so many people have had that same feeling, and they walked away from it. What would you tell somebody who had a feeling where they felt like they weren't being seen or heard in a public space? What would you say to them?
Yeah. I think that I would always encourage people to just do it scared. And you've probably heard that phrase before. Sure, we get nervous. I worried that they might say no, but we had to ask, right? Because there is so much strength in togetherness, and there's so much strength in unity. And again, I'm not Puerto Rican, but I represent so many folks who are part of the Puerto Rican community. And even if I didn't, I'm here as a New Yorker in community with folks who lost loved ones in a tragedy. And so to know that we are part of this community and that folks are being left out is not to speak to the reality that we are in fact one. And so I would say to remember that there is strength in togetherness, and that speaking up for someone else feels so much more powerful than you can imagine.
And I also want to just say again that this was just in time for Hispanic Heritage Month, which is amazing. Can you discuss the significance of this and just the work that has been going on in New York City to support this community?
Yeah. I think the significance of this happening during Hispanic Heritage Month for us, I think, is rooted in the idea that the Latino community really is one community. And while, folks might be from Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico or Colombia or Mexico, Ecuador, et cetera, we really are one Latino community. And the ability as a Dominican woman to stand up and say, hey, there's a Puerto Rican flag missing, I think for me really underscores that connection and that sense of family. And, I think Hispanic Heritage Month is an important time where the whole kind of country pauses to recognize and celebrate our Latino community and the gains that we've made and the progress that we've made, but also pause to reflect on how can we do better? How can we better serve our community? Where are we falling short? And I think this is a really important time of reflection, and I'm grateful that we have it every year.
And I also want to take a moment to explore other ways you supported the Hispanic community, and you've done this through your work with the Legal Aid Society. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yes, many moons ago, I was an intern for Legal Aid, actually, when I was at college in Nashville, down in Tennessee, and I served primarily as like a translator because we had, at the time, Nashville had a really quick growing Spanish-speaking community, but not a lot of folks who spoke Spanish. And so I really got to play a role in helping people reach critical services by offering language support. And that was really special because it was primarily focused on folks who needed support with domestic violence. And that's something that we do a lot of work on now in my official capacity as Assembly member with the Brides March, which is an organization that's committed to combating domestic violence, and so many other great groups.
That's amazing. And now, we're towards the end. I want to take a moment. Could you just let everybody know what is maybe one pressing issue? We know that you're working on getting the Puerto Rican flag in the museum, but what's something else that's going on in the Bronx that is a pressing issue for you?
I think one of the things, I think everyone saw that comment, that off-color comment by Governor Hochul that said, there are kids in the Bronx who don't even know the word computer. It was off-color, but I think the point was to highlight the fact that we need more digital literacy, we need more digital support programs, we need more tech programs in the Bronx. And I'm really committed to making sure that that becomes a reality, that we are thinking about how to train our young people, like we started this conversation, in the importance of digital literacy, media literacy, and preparing them for those opportunities that will carry them into a successful future.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Now, I want to take a moment to have a little bit of fun and do some rapid fire questions for you. So, what's your favorite Bronx hidden gem?
Ooh, that is such a good question. I would say the El Valle on Longwood and Southern Boulevard. Now, I know there's a few El Valles throughout the borough, so that might start a war, but I would say that the very best one is the El Valle on Longwood and Southern Boulevard. I go there pretty often.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to say that there's a lot around.
Yeah, there are, but that's the special one.
Now, what's your favorite cuisine?
My favorite cuisine depends on the day. Sometimes I'm in the mood for really great Italian food, so I'm going to go to Arthur Avenue, one of the perks of being from the Bronx. But I also love traditional kind of Dominican Spanish food, so maybe that's why I love El Valle as much as I do.
Okay, amazing. And now, what's your favorite Bronx tourist site?
Oh, my favorite Bronx tourist site, I honestly have to say, is probably the Botanical Garden. It feels like a true oasis. And a real escape. But honestly, another close second is probably Orchard Beach, because you go to Orchard Beach and you get like a flavor. You get flavor of the borough, and I think that's so special to be able to go to a place and not only see the beauty but also feel it. And Orchard Beach really gives you that. Now,
with that, I just want to take a moment to thank you so much for joining us and having this really interesting conversation. You had such an amazing background that I'm like, I wish I've had that. I've done as much as you have done.
Thank you.
But thank you so much for joining us and having this discussion.
No, thank you, and thank you. You have quite the story as well, and so we're really proud of you and everything you've done here at BronxNet, and can't wait to see where you go. But thank you for having me.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for watching. And remember, you can always watch this program anytime, anywhere on BronxNet.org and YouTube. While you're there, be sure to follow BronxNet on social media to find out who will be the next community leader we will sit down with on In the District. From BronxNet's Media and Technology Studios in the South Bronx, I'm Kibin Alleyne. Talk soon.